All right, guys, today we're going to start taking a look at a significant time period in U.S. history known as the Civil Rights Movement. Now, just to kind of keep in mind here, this is primarily taking place during the 1960s. So, we've talked about JFK and LBJ and, just a lot of the different things that were going on throughout the 1960s. I mean, the 1960s, honestly, in my opinion as a historian, is probably the craziest, most tumultuous, maybe most significant decade in U.S. history. There was just a lot of stuff going on in the 1960s. The assassination of JFK, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the Civil Rights Movement. Vietnam starts to really pick up around the mid-60s and then goes the whole way into the mid-70s. So, I mean, there was just a lot of stuff going on during this decade. And so, but like I mentioned, I mean, the Civil Rights Movement was a big part of that. So before we get into the actual events of the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, I want to touch upon this philosophy of nonviolent protest. So the reason I want to talk about this is because this would be the cornerstone of MLK's philosophy of achieving equality and civil rights. So, I'll just kind of go into a little background here and then I'll explain what I'm talking about. But there was a famous American author named Henry David Thoreau, and I don't know if you guys ever heard of him, but basically he wrote an essay on the use of nonviolent protest. So like it says here, nonviolence is the philosophy and strategy for social change that rejects the use of violence. And so a lot of times, just the way that we think is that if you're trying to get people to agree with you or to change something, especially in society, because, I know you guys probably don't think about this much, but maybe as you get older, you'll kind of realize this, but change is hard to create. And, the reason for that is because, human beings tend to get into what we call a comfort zone. And, we all have a comfort zone. It's where we're kind of used to how things are going and we're kind of okay with it. And we just want to kind of keep doing that, because when you change something, you then have to try to figure it out, and it can be kind of stressful. And, one example that I use, and maybe I've talked about this before, but it's like the beginning of the school year. It's always kind of a stressful time because students are getting new schedules. They have new teachers. They're in different classes. You got to figure out what lunch period you're eating, who you're going to sit, like all these things that go along with that. So that's just a change in, your life that it's not really that big of a deal, but it's still stressful. So that's why change is so hard to create most of the time in society. And so, but like I said a second ago, but a lot of times people think that the way you get that change to happen is by force. Right? Like we use force. We call in the military. We call in the police. Or if it's the civilians that want to create change, it'll be like a protest, or people are smashing windows, and, things get kind of crazy sometimes. So this whole philosophy of nonviolent protest is really ingenious, but it hadn't been used for very long. So like it says here, nonviolence is a philosophy and strategy for change that rejects the use of violence. So it's you're creating change without using violent methods. And so you guys might be wondering, like, well, how do you do that? So like it says here, methods, basically use methods such as civil disobedience, like sit-ins, protests, etc. And we're going to talk more about this later. But Mahatma Gandhi is a notable pioneer in the use of nonviolent protest. And, he was from India. He was a civil rights leader in India. And basically the British were ruling over India at the time. And so Gandhi and his followers would use nonviolent protest to basically create the change in society that they wanted to see. So like it says here, he used assault march, hunger strikes, things of that nature to increase awareness, to bring awareness to the injustice that was occurring so that people would get on board with changing it. And so, like it says here, nonviolent acts still gain attention, in turn raising awareness. So like I just said, basically you're protesting in a way that isn't violent, so you're not hurting people, you're not destroying anything, you're really doing nothing wrong. But what you're doing is you're bringing attention to the injustice that is occurring, and then by bringing attention to it, like I said, you're going to gain more support because people will start to realize, like, oh, wow, why is this law in place that doesn't really make sense, or that is restricting people's rights and, basically promoting inequality in a society? Like, we shouldn't have those things. So that's kind of what the whole purpose of nonviolent protest is. And like it says here, MLK and other civil rights advocates use many of these methods to raise awareness towards their cause. So MLK saw the effectiveness of this nonviolent protest in India and, based off of those ideas of Thoreau. And he said, this is what we're going to use. This is going to be our vehicle to promote civil rights and equality here in the United States. And we're not going to do anything wrong in the process. We're just going to bring awareness to these, inequalities that, exist in our nation, so that we can get people to realize this, and in turn we can get people to support the change. And so this is Henry David Thoreau. He's the guy that kind of came up with the idea. And here's Gandhi. He's the guy that really, put it into practice in India. And so here in this picture, we see Gandhi leading what was called the Salt March, which was a march to the sea. And as you can see, it involved thousands of people. And so this was a good example of nonviolent protest, because they're not doing anything wrong, but this sheer number of people and, the attention that it, basically got the attention of a lot of people, around the world, because they were saying, well, what's this all about? What are they protesting? And, it's again, what I mentioned a minute ago, which is this just brings attention to the issue, and it creates a dialogue, and then that dialogue can gain support. And then as a result of that, you can create change in society. And that's kind of, the mentality and philosophy that MLK would adopt, and it would prove to be very effective. And like I said, it's a really genius way of creating change. So, all right, so let's get into the civil rights movement. So the Freedom Now movement, as you can see here, it says on February 1st, 1964, African-American students went to a nearby dime store, basically kind of like a diner, and sat at a lunch counter where blacks never sat before. And essentially, what this is all about is this group of men, they just basically sat at a counter where African Americans were not supposed to sit. And, this was obviously, in the segregated South. And, they're not doing anything wrong, right? This is a good a good example of nonviolent protest. They're not doing anything wrong. They're sitting there. They're not causing problems. But what happened was, when they sat there, they got people's attention, because it was kind of like, people started to kind of, have a dialogue. It created a conversation, which is, why aren't they allowed to sit there, right? Is there any good reason? Like, why is this the law or the rule? And, and again, it didn't turn violent, so it's nonviolent protest. They weren't, nobody tried to fight with them. They weren't thrown to the ground, anything like that. It just, and they continued to do this day after day. And what it did was it created the dialogue and it came to the point where people started to ask that question: why can't these men sit there? Why is this not allowed? And so it brought attention to that injustice. And so that, pattern of nonviolent protest continued. And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, it creates a dialogue as to, like, why do these people not have equal rights? Why are their civil rights not being upheld? Why don't we change this? You know what I mean? That's what was the conversation that started to be had in the South, that really just had never been had before. And, as I mentioned a bit ago, it's kind of like, change comes slow a lot of times. And, people resist change. And, a lot of times the reason for that is, like I'd mentioned, it's because change requires, change causes stress, because you have to kind of figure things out, right? If you do something different, now you have to figure out how we're going to do this. And a lot of times people want to resist that. It's just human nature. They don't want to be stressed out. They don't want to have to deal with it. So that's kind of why, not just when it comes to civil rights, but a lot of different things. I mean, I'll even use the example of education. It's like a few years back, we changed the bell schedule, and it took a couple years, because we realized the bell schedule we had wasn't really very effective. It wasn't efficient. So we wanted to change it, but we didn't know what we wanted to change it to. And there were different models, and we had to try and, some teachers went to other schools and took a look at what they were doing. And I mean, it was kind of a big thing. Whereas you would think, like, changing the bell schedule would just be a matter of, hey, let's just change the times and get it passed by the board and we're good. But it was a lot more work than that. And so, as it says here, nonviolence in action. So following the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, civil rights leaders met in 1957 in Atlanta to discuss future strategy. So we know about Rosa Parks and the bus boycott. And again, I mentioned when we went over that, that was one of the early stages of the civil rights movement. So after, that situation was met with success, civil rights leaders met and said, where do we go from here? How do we keep this ball rolling forward and keep that momentum going? So students protest, civil rights leaders reorganized the MIA into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and you're going to see a lot of acronyms here again. I mentioned before, when it comes to government, organizations, the military, they use a lot of acronyms just because I guess it's easier, shorter, right? So this was an alliance of church-based African-American organizations dedicated to ending discrimination. So basically it's an organization created to promote civil rights and equality. So Martin Luther King Jr. led it using nonviolent resistance. So again, this was, obviously he's going to become the face of the civil rights movement, and, he's going to become the primary leader. And so he brought with him the philosophy of nonviolent protest, and everybody kind of got on board with that. Now, later on, some people are going to dispute that and say it's not the most effective, it's not working fast enough, and things like that. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. But at the beginning, that's the primary method of, initiating change and creating these dialogues, as I mentioned. So they also used sit-ins, which were demonstrations protested by, basically people protest by sitting down and refusing to leave. In Kansas and Oklahoma. So they literally just did what it says. It was a sit-in. You sat. You didn't leave. Whenever police or whoever showed up telling you to leave, you just kind of said no, and maybe they start dragging you away in handcuffs or whatever. But what that does is, again, you're not doing anything violent. You're not acting out. You're not smashing windows. But when you're getting dragged away and the police are arresting you, people start to see this, there's news coverage, and then it creates a dialogue, and people will start to say, well, why is this happening? Oh, they're just sitting there. What are they protesting? Oh, well, they're protesting segregation. Well, why is it segregated in the South? Like things of that nature. And again, that's going to, basically create a lot of support for the cause, and that's how change happens. So also they founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, which was a loose association of student activism, primarily in the South. So again, student activists, right? So college students mostly would lead these nonviolent protests. This is just kind of an interesting side note that a lot of people don't know, but MLK's name was not Martin Luther King originally. So MLK's father, Martin Luther King Sr., was also a preacher, and his name was Michael King. So Michael King traveled to Europe and learned about the Protestant Reformation. And this is a huge event in history that most people don't even know about, which to this day, I didn't know about it till I went to college, but I'm surprised people don't know about this. But you'll learn about it in world history. But basically, I'll give you the quick version, which is this guy on the right, this monk, his name was Martin Luther. He protested the Catholic Church for a lot of their what he considered to be unethical practices. And I'll just give you a quick example. Basically, the Catholic Church was charging people for forgiveness, making people pay money to be forgiven of their sins. And so, Martin Luther saw these sort of things happening, and he didn't like it. So he protested the Catholic Church. Now, that might not seem like a big deal today, but back when it happened, going against the church at that time was basically a death sentence. You could be tortured for that. You could be executed for it. And so it was a pretty big deal. And what happened as a result of that was, when Christianity first started, it was just the Catholic Church. That was it. Today there's a lot of denominations. We have Protestants, Methodists, Calvinists, Lutherans, just all these different, there's hundreds of Christian denominations, and that's where that came from. And so, today it's not just the Catholic Church. There's even a number of different Catholic denominations. But regardless, Michael King heard this story, and he was so inspired by it that he changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr. So it's pretty crazy that somebody could be so moved by the actions of a historical figure that they would change their name. But that's how Michael King became Martin Luther King. And then obviously, MLK Jr. changed his name as well. I just thought that was an interesting story that probably most people don't know. So these are just obviously some pictures of some sit-ins. So you have a group of students here, young people mostly. These civil rights activists, they were very diverse. It's not just young people. There were old people too, people of all different colors, and basically everybody just was fighting for the common cause, which was the, promoting civil rights, getting rid of inequality and making sure that people were being treated the way they should be treated. And this is a famous picture here of the police with their dogs trying to attack protesters. So the Freedom Riders, the SNCC inspired the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, which was a northern nonviolent protest group against racial discrimination. The Freedom Riders, as they became known, were CORE leaders who would take bus trips throughout the South trying to gain national attention. So again, it's a form of nonviolent protest. They're just riding on buses through the South, but they're trying to target the most segregated and discriminatory cities in the South. And so, like it says here, this erupted in violence in Alabama when a white mob firebombed 2 buses. So they literally threw like Molotov cocktails. If you don't know what those are, it's basically when you put, gasoline or something in a bottle and light it on fire. This guy at the bottom here, Eugene Bull Connor, as he was known, was Birmingham city commissioner, and he blamed the Freedom Riders for the violence because he's saying you guys were antagonizing this. And here we have Bobby Kennedy, because he was the attorney general under JFK, and he's kind of the guy that sort of has to address this and figure out what they're going to do. So President Kennedy asked the riders to stop so they did not get hurt, but the SNCC refused. Diane Nash and other leaders went to Birmingham to continue the protest. So Kennedy was basically asking them to stop because he was worried somebody was going to get killed, and he felt like that responsibility was going to fall on him if that did happen. So they were met by an angry mob, and President Kennedy eventually sent federal troops to protect the riders. Bobby Kennedy, his brother, was the attorney general, as I mentioned. He spoke to the Interstate Commerce Commission, who's basically in charge of like buses and things of that nature, to strengthen its desegregation regulations. So he's telling them, can you guys take some action here to make sure that desegregation occurs, and hopefully this can all be resolved peacefully. So here you see a map of the route that the Freedom Riders took through the South. And this is when the bus got bombed. You can see this guy here got injured. So, continued struggles. The Freedom Riders' courage and commitment to nonviolence helped advance their effort to end racial discrimination. However, segregation remained in many areas of Southern life, including the schools and public facilities. So at the University of Mississippi, the NAACP obtained a court order which required the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith as a student at the school. This guy down here, Governor Russ Barnett, declared no school will be integrated while I am your governor. So he's saying this isn't going to happen. The governor personally prevented Meredith from registering, and a riot broke out later that night. President Kennedy ordered an army to restore order. So again, Kennedy's sort of the one that's been tasked with resolving the situation peacefully. So there's James Meredith. And like it says here, Albany, Georgia, not all peaceful protests were successful. Police Chief Lori Pritchett quickly arrested all protesters. So basically, like it says here, he tried to use nonviolence to stop the nonviolent protests. MLK gets arrested at this event. The SCLC then focused on Birmingham. April 1963, there were a series of boycotts, marches, and sit-ins, so a series of nonviolent protests. May 2nd, 1963, thousands of youth marched the streets, and Bull Connor and the police arrested 600. And the next day, they used police force, which helped the civil rights movement. So if the police acted out violently, then that was sort of, worked to the benefit of the civil rights activists, because now the police or whoever's acting out violently, they become the bad guys. Here we see MLK getting arrested. Pretty famous mugshot there. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, President Kennedy decided to take a stand on civil rights. In the summer of 1963, he asked Congress to enact legislation or make a law giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public. So basically he's saying, let's pass desegregation laws. The March on Washington, August 28, 1963, 200,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. The march director was A. Philip Randolph, and John Lewis spoke. MLK gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, which would become one of America's most famous speeches.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. Exalted. And every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when it happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
So, like it says here, the act passes. The success of the March on Washington, D.C. raised hopes for the civil rights legislation. LBJ strongly supported the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. So like it says here, the Civil Rights Act banned discrimination in various areas of society, including employment based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. Basically, it was widespread desegregation. So made it illegal, made segregation illegal. And notice it says LBJ because JFK was the one that proposed it, but he was assassinated before it was passed. So it was passed under LBJ. Voting rights activists started to focus on voter registration. In Mississippi, African Americans were often denied voting rights in Mississippi. 40% of the state's population was African American, and only 5% were eligible voters. Between 1939 to 1950, 33 lynchings occurred. Violence was profound in Mississippi. Renewed efforts. The Council of Federation Organization, the COFO, coordinated voter drives. They started freedom elections, which were mock elections. Some 80,000 African Americans voted, and it introduced thousands to the voting process. So essentially what this is saying is civil rights activists are trying to get people registered to vote and to participate in the voting process, because now, they're basically saying if we can get the right people in office, we can make sure these laws continue to get passed, to end discrimination. And so that's why the civil rights movement was, basically focused heavily on getting people used to the voting process, getting people registered to vote, because again, that's where a lot of the power was in the hands of the voters, because they could put the right people in office to make sure that, the elected officials were going to support the civil rights legislation. And so that's kind of where this the focus was. A new approach was to bring white volunteers into the voting booths of the South. Robert Moses led this movement. The Freedom Summer, as it became known, during the Freedom Summer in 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, which banned the payment of poll taxes as a condition for voting in federal elections. So I don't know if you guys learned this in US 1, but they used to make people pay a tax to vote. And so if you were poor, you couldn't vote. And so, the government took action to get rid of that. And so people it basically was making sure that everybody had access to vote and not just people with money. So in June 1964, the goal was to register as many African Americans to vote as possible. Political organization, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, was created to give African Americans an equal say at the Democratic National Convention. Although it was quite unpopular with the MFDP, President Johnson worked to get the party recognition, but they did not proceed at the convention with an official delegation. So again, this is just about getting people involved politically, getting people involved in the political process, getting people elected to public office that are going to promote civil rights and end the racial injustice. And that's what a lot of these efforts were aimed at. So in Selma in 1965, civil rights workers launched a registration drive in Selma, Alabama. MLK led the registration, and many were arrested and beaten. In response, some 600 people on Sunday, March 7th, led a protest march. Governor George Wallace ordered the police to prevent the march, and many were beaten. President Johnson was outraged by the attack of what he called Bloody Sunday and declared that all Americans take up the cause of civil rights. So George Wallace, he eventually would run for president, and he was an open segregationist. So, he basically said, I'm going to try and keep segregation. Eventually, he would run for president, and there was an assassination attempt on his life. He got shot like 3 times or something like that, but he survived the attempt. But on his deathbed, he actually sort of repented and said that he regretted all the, segregationist, stuff that he was promoting. The Voting Rights Act, 1 week later, under federal protection, the marchers were successful. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which put the registration process under the federal government. So again, the government is trying to ensure that everybody's going to have access to voting, and that way, they can get the right people in office. Okay, and so new direction. So as the civil rights movement continued, many African Americans questioned the effectiveness of nonviolent protests. So people were starting to, I don't think there was any doubt in whether or not nonviolent protests worked. I think it was more about how quickly the changes and the results were being seen. And for some people, it wasn't happening fast enough. So the Black Muslims, also known as the Nation of Islam, was founded by Wallace D. Fard. It was based on the Islamic religion founded by the Prophet Muhammad. And the emphasis of this religion was on black supremacy over all other races. Elijah Muhammad would become its leader, and there were 8,000 members under his reign, which preached black nationalism. So nationalism is basically like an extreme pride in your nation, right? And a nation isn't just a country, it could be a group of people. And so in this case, it was the Nation of Islam, right? And so this definitely was a contrast to the philosophy of not Malcolm X, but MLK. MLK was all about nonviolent protests and creating change through the use of nonviolence. And, this new direction, like I said, kind of contrasted that. And that brings us to Malcolm X, probably the second most famous civil rights leader. And so, like it says here, he was a leading minister for the Nation of Islam who criticized the goals and strategies of nonviolent civil rights organizations. He's kind of just, he has the same objective as MLK, which is ending, racial inequality and promoting civil rights. But his philosophy of how that should be attained was basically much different than MLK's. Malcolm X referred to violence as a means to promote civil rights, so violence was acceptable under the philosophy of Malcolm X. His radical beliefs led to his assassination in February of 1965, and, this is, there's kind of a conspiracy related to the death of Malcolm X, but the predominant theory on what happened to him was he was actually assassinated by the Nation of Islam because he had a conflict with Elijah Muhammad, and that conflict would lead to basically their friendship ending. And as a result of that, many believe that the ending of that friendship, Elijah Muhammad had him assassinated. And I think we're going to watch something on Malcolm X. He's a really interesting individual. He was kind of a criminal early in life, and then he went to prison, and when he was in prison, he found Islam and really turned his life around and started reading and became like really intellectual. And again, he's got some really interesting things to say, and he's a really intelligent guy. And so, but unfortunately, his life ended early. But he was known for saying civil rights by any means necessary. And that means, even if it means violence, that's what we have to do, right? So it's not just nonviolent protests anymore. It's going to be whatever we need to do to achieve our goals. Okay, and so the movement fractures. The civil rights movement was made up of diverse groups united by a common goal of ending racial segregation. But by the mid-1960s, many conflicts had surfaced among these organizations, as I'd kind of mentioned a second ago. So the Black Power movement, like Malcolm X, certain groups began to question civil rights through nonviolence. Some even questioned the white man helping the cause because they were trying to take it over. So a lot of civil rights leaders started to become suspicious of white people helping out, and I think we saw that in some of the earlier pictures with the Freedom Riders and the sit-ins and things like that. It wasn't just African Americans. It was actually, people of all races that were, in favor of ending racial injustice. And so, but like it says here, eventually, people started to kind of question that. So this in turn led to a growing black nationalism movement and eventually led to a black power movement called black separatism. Some suggest it led to cultural pride and heritage, while others felt it created hostility towards the movement. So, black separatism obviously meaning like we're going to separate from everyone else and we're going to, kind of take control of this by ourselves. Okay, so the Black Panther Party was created and led by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. They organized youthful black folk into a political movement. Their platform is just another name for like their plan or mission statement, was that black people will not be free until we are free to determine our own destiny. Also, they wanted to create black defense groups. It's just an old picture of the Black Panthers. So tragic events. The Black Power movement was not the only challenge that Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders faced. White Americans had mixed reactions to efforts to extend civil rights beyond desegregation. And so MLK went to Chicago in 1966. The SCLC was the only nonviolent protesters left. MLK tested his movement in the North in Chicago, but however, he had little impact in northern cities compared to his success in the South. He was attacked and struck in the head by a rock while leading a peaceful demonstration. So while he was in Chicago, he got hit in the head by a rock. But like it says here, it didn't seem like the effects of the civil rights movement were as dramatic in the North. And, I'm not really sure why, but I think perhaps maybe it's because the North wasn't segregated and maybe the hostilities weren't quite as bad up there. So I'm not sure. But urban violence. So there was a series of urban violence and Black Power movement led to a white backlash against civil rights. Despite improvements made, discrimination was still commonplace. Hundreds of riots throughout the cities took place. The Kerner Commission was created by Congress to investigate the violence, and their report claimed that white racism was largely responsible. MLK called for a Poor People's Campaign to lead a march in Washington, D.C., to address the abuses of federal government spending. So basically, MLK was going to lead a protest in D.C. To kind of bring awareness to the wasteful spending that was occurring in our government, and a big part of that was in Vietnam. I mentioned this when we covered JFK and LBJ, that MLK was very critical of the Vietnam War because number one, I think it was because people were getting killed, but also because the U.S. government was spending a ton of money on this war in Vietnam that a lot of people didn't feel we needed to be fighting, and also that money could be used better here in our own country to help people to end, poverty and racial discrimination. Assassination of MLK. So King went to Memphis, Tennessee to show his support for a strike that was occurring there. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., a man who became a symbol for the civil rights era, was shot down by a sniper. As a result of his death, riots spread all over the South. A week after rioting, 45 were dead and thousands were injured. So this is a famous picture. You can see MLK's on the ground here. They were in a hotel, and he came out, and he was standing sort of like on the balcony or whatever, and he got shot from across the street, and then these are his friends pointing to where the shots came from. And they've actually preserved that motel as a historical landmark. So this was the guy who got arrested, James Earl Ray. There he is. He actually fled to Europe. He tried to escape. I believe they caught him in England. So he was trying to escape, and they caught him at the airport, I believe. There's his mugshot. He spent the rest of his life in prison, and the rest of his life he claimed that he didn't do it. Again, just like Oswald, who knows? But there is a larger conspiracy behind this. Some people believe that it wasn't just this guy. There were more people involved. Again, we don't know for sure. But these are some pictures of the damages that were done with the rioting after MLK's assassination. I think people were just angry, frustrated. This is MLK's funeral. So you can see a huge outpouring of support. This is his wife, Loretta Scott King, and these are his kids. It's pretty sad. A crisis in direction. So the assassination of MLK was a vital blow to the struggle for civil rights, and as a result, African-American civil rights leaders addressed new problems. The SCLC was determined to continue MLK's work and sponsored the Poor People's Campaign. So they went through with this protest that MLK had planned. The marchers reached Capitol Hill and constructed Resurrection City to draw attention to poverty, but it turned out to be a disaster. The failure of the campaign and the death of MLK led to an end of a new political movement. The SCLC no longer played a leading role in civil rights issues. So you can see here they set up like a camp in D.C., and there's Washington Monument, but it got rained out, I believe. I think that's what happened, and then it just didn't really turn out as well as they had hoped. Black nationalism. So the federal government under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, launched a program to expose and neutralize black nationalist groups. Internal conflicts in the SNCC and the Black Panthers led to the end of the violent civil rights movement. So this guy, J. Edgar Hoover, he was the head of the FBI for a long time. I want to say like 40 years or something like that. And he had, a lot of celebrities, but also, I remember hearing John Lennon was on his list. MLK was on his list, and they were seen as suspects, communist suspects. So basically, a lot of the anybody who was protesting like Vietnam and stuff like that, a lot of times they were put on the list because he said that they were communist sympathizers. And so they had wiretaps in their phones and all kinds of stuff like that. So it was pretty crazy. But affirmative action, so programs designed to compensate for previous discrimination by giving preference to ethnic minorities and women in admission and hiring. Critics argued that affirmative action led to reverse discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court case was heard, University of California versus Bakke, which was a white man unfairly denied admission into medical school because he was white, basically. So he said that's reverse racism. So I didn't get in because I'm not an ethnic minority. And so that's sort of the counter argument for affirmative action. And actually, the Supreme Court ruled last year, I believe it was, to end affirmative action because it led to discrimination. I'm trying to think. I believe that was stemming from Harvard. Harvard was denying Asian Americans admission into their school because they were saying that there were too many. And then, that led to a lot of controversy because people were saying, well, now you're discriminating against Asians and not letting them into Harvard because you're saying there's too many. And so I believe that's what the ruling was from the Supreme Court. Successes of the movement: Carl Stokes became the first African American to be elected as a mayor of a major U.S. city in Cleveland. The National Black Political Convention was created to ensure African Americans would continue to gain political influence. Activists formed the National Black Political Convention. By the end of the 1970s, more than 4,500 African Americans held elected office in the United States. And progress continues to move forward. And, obviously we know that President Obama would eventually be elected into office and, things would go from there.